You wake up, and there is blood on the ground beneath you. No pad, no tampon, no door to lock. Just you, the fire ash, and the people who already know exactly what is happening. For most of human history, this morning was not a private event. It was a community event, tracked, expected, and sometimes even celebrated. This is the story of what a period actually looked like 20,000 years ago, and why the silence around it is one of the newest habits our species has ever picked up. Let's start with the obvious problem. Bodies do not fossilize blood. There is no skeleton that tells you directly how a woman managed her cycle in the Ice Age. So how do researchers know anything at all? They build the picture from three places: what the body itself reveals, what closely related living societies do today, and what objects and pigments survive in the archaeological record. Start with the body. Anthropologist Beverly Strassman spent years studying the Dogon people of Mali, a farming population that, unlike most of the modern world, does not use hormonal birth control. Her research found that Dogon women experience roughly 100 menstrual cycles across a lifetime. Compare that to a typical woman in an industrialized country today, who can experience closer to 400 cycles across her life. That is not a small difference. That is 4 times more. Why the gap? Because a body spending most of its adult years either pregnant or breastfeeding simply is not cycling as often. Constant nursing suppresses ovulation. Frequent pregnancy does too. Researchers, including Strassman, argue this is closer to the ancestral pattern for most of our evolutionary past. A life built around long stretches, without a period at all, punctuated by menstruation, rather than defined by it. Here is the detail that gets me every time. The thing we now think of as a monthly inevitability may have actually been the exception for a hunter-gatherer woman, not the rule. There is a related idea worth mentioning here, carefully. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues developed what is known as the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that human menopause itself, women living for decades after their reproductive years end, evolved because older women who stopped cycling could invest that energy into feeding grandchildren instead. It is a well-cited theory in evolutionary anthropology. It is also not universally accepted. Other researchers propose competing explanations for human menopause, and the debate remains active. We mention it here because it fits the larger pattern. Across a human lifetime, a hunter-gatherer woman's body spent long stretches not menstruating at all, whether through pregnancy, nursing, or eventually menopause. That changes the whole question. It was not the frequency of periods that shaped ancestral life. It was what happened on the rare occasions when one occurred, and how the group responded. This is where ethnography becomes useful. Carefully. Anthropologists, like Marjorie Shostak, who lived among and documented the Juhowansi people of the Kalahari, and researchers, who later worked with the Hadza of Tanzania, recorded menstrual customs that were remarkably consistent across unrelated cultures on different continents. A quick note before we go further. The Juhowansi and the Hadza are not frozen relics of the Stone Age. They are contemporary people living modern lives today, in a changing world, with their own history and agency. Anthropologists study them because certain features of their subsistence strategy, foraging without agriculture, offer a useful comparison, not because they are a window directly into the past. With that said, what these studies found again and again is seclusion, not shame. Among many foraging and small-scale societies, a menstruating woman would spend time apart from daily tasks, often in a separate hut or shelter, cared for by other women, rather than isolated in punishment. This detail matters because pop culture tends to flatten it into one idea. Menstrual seclusion equals menstrual taboo equals women were treated as dirty. The actual anthropological record is messier and more interesting than that. In some documented societies, seclusion functioned as protection and rest, a break from physical labor at exactly the point in the cycle when the body is doing the most internal work. In others, it carried genuine stigma. Researchers are still split on how much of the practice was about spiritual belief, social organization, or simple practicality, and the honest answer is that it likely varied enormously by group, by region, and by era. Anthropologist Chris Knight, in his book Blood Relations, proposed a provocative theory that synchronized menstruation and seclusion practices may have functioned as a form of collective female bargaining power in early human societies, tied to the timing of hunting and food sharing. It is an influential idea. It is also heavily contested. Many researchers argue the evidence for cycle synchronization itself is weak, and that Knight's broader theory reaches further than the data can support. We are including it here because it shaped decades of discussion, not because it is settled fact. Before we get to physical evidence, there is one more piece of the puzzle worth pausing on: timekeeping. Archaeologist Alexander Marshak argued in the 1970s that certain engraved bones and antlers from the Upper Paleolithic, including markings on a bone tool known as the Ashango bone found near Lake Edward in the Democratic Republic of Congo, represented deliberate lunar tallies, notches counting the phases of the moon. His interpretation was bold, and it remains genuinely contested. Some researchers accept it as plausible evidence of early timekeeping. Others argue the markings could just as easily be decorative or represent something else entirely, and that we are projecting a modern habit of counting onto ambiguous scratches. Either way, the moon's 29.5-day cycle sits suspiciously close to the average human menstrual cycle, and some researchers have wondered aloud whether ancient timekeeping and menstrual tracking were connected. It is an intriguing possibility. It is not a proven one. While we're being honest about what is and is not proven, it's worth addressing something you may have heard: the claim that women living in close quarters, like a foraging band or a college dormitory, naturally synchronize their cycles over time. This idea, sometimes called the McClintock effect, after the researcher who first proposed it in 1971, captured public imagination for decades. More recent, larger studies attempting to replicate it have largely failed to find reliable evidence that menstrual synchrony actually occurs. Most researchers today treat it as a compelling story that the data simply does not support. We mention this because it is exactly the kind of tidy, appealing claim this channel tries to avoid repeating without scrutiny. Now let's talk about material evidence, because this is where things get genuinely surprising. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologist Christopher Hens-Hillwood and his team uncovered pieces of ochre, a natural iron-rich pigment, deliberately engraved with geometric patterns and dated to around 75,000 years ago. Ochre shows up constantly at ancient human sites, used for art, for symbolic marking, and, some researchers argue, potentially for absorbent or symbolic use tied to menstrual and birth blood. To be clear, that last use is speculative. We cannot prove a specific piece of ochre was used that way. What we can say is that ochre, and the color red more broadly, held deep symbolic weight across an enormous span of prehistory, and blood, all blood, menstrual, hunting, and birth, sat at the center of a lot of that symbolism. For absorption itself, the honest scientific answer is, we do not know exactly what ancient women used, because organic materials like moss, soft bark, animal hide, or woven plant fiber decompose. They do not survive tens of thousands of years in the archaeological record. Researchers can only reason from what nearby, comparable societies used historically, which includes exactly those materials: moss, hide, and plant fibers, sometimes tucked into a simple belt. So, let's reconstruct a plausible morning. You are a woman in a small foraging band, somewhere in the Pleistocene. You wake, notice the blood, and quietly tell another woman in camp. There is no panic. She already expected it might happen soon, because she has tracked your cycle the way the group tracks the moon, the rains, and the herds, as one more rhythm among many. You are handed soft moss, or worked hide. You may step back from the day's foraging route. You are not hidden away in disgrace. You are, in many documented parallel societies, treated as briefly powerful, even a little dangerous, in a way that earns space rather than erases you. Here is the counterintuitive twist. In a huge number of small-scale societies studied by anthropologists, menstrual blood was not simply feared as unclean. It was frequently treated as potent, something connected to fertility, to danger, to the forces that create life itself. Fear and reverence sat side by side. That combination, feared and sacred at once, is much closer to the anthropological reality than the modern shorthand of pure taboo. And this is where the story bends back toward you. The idea that periods should be hidden, silent, and never mentioned in public is not some ancient universal law carried down from deep prehistory. In many documented ancestral and traditional contexts, menstruation was known, tracked, and managed communally. The privatization of the period, the disposable pad, the whispered conversation, the assumption that this is something to conceal from 100% of the men in your life is a comparatively recent cultural habit, shaped heavily by 19th and 20th century industrial hygiene marketing, not by some ancient instinct toward shame. It is worth noting that shame around menstruation did not stay constant even after prehistory ended. In the historical record, ideas actually got worse for a long stretch before they got better. The Hippocratic medical texts of ancient Greece and later Roman writers like Pliny the Elder describe menstrual blood in openly hostile terms, associated with spoiling wine, dulling knives, and driving dogs mad. None of that is biologically accurate. It reflects the anxieties of a particular literate, urban, patriarchal culture, not some universal ancient consensus. This matters because it shows the trajectory was not a straight line from primitive taboo to modern enlightenment. Attitudes shifted back and forth across different eras, different regions, and different economic systems, often tracking who held religious and medical authority at the time. By the 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe and North America, a new force entered the picture: commerce. As disposable sanitary products became a manufacturable, sellable good, advertising built an entire vocabulary around discretion, invisibility, and freshness, teaching generations of women that the ideal period was one nobody could ever detect. Historian Shara Vostral, who has written extensively on the history of menstrual technology, has documented how this marketing language actively constructed the modern expectation of near-total concealment, layered on top of whatever older cultural attitudes already existed. In other words, some of what feels like ancient, hardwired shame is actually a comparatively young invention, built for a marketplace, not carried down from the Ice Age. None of this is a suggestion to change how you manage your own period today. Modern hygiene products exist for good reasons. They are safe, effective, and part of a system many people rely on, and there is no reason to imitate the past for its own sake. This is simply about understanding where the silence came from and noticing that it is newer and less universal than it feels. You woke up this morning, and there was blood on the ground beneath you. 20,000 years ago, that would not have been a secret you carried alone into the day. It would have been information, shared, expected, and folded quietly into the rhythm of the whole camp.